Hello and welcome to Sound Like, where today we're going to be looking at Defector. So following my recent cover of Defector, I've decided to do a Sound Like video for it to show you all the pedals and all the tricks that I'm using to sound just like it. As usual, throughout the whole video I'm going to be breaking down each section for the song, showing you all the pedals and all the tricks that I'm using and the broad sounds that I'm searching for each section and how to sound like it the best. Throughout the video, whenever I cover a stereo sound, I will of course identify the pedal or the broad sound in which you'd want to go for if you are only limited to a mono board. And for the stereo parts of the song where they appear, I will identify what pedal is on either side and to give you a good idea about what's kind of being put in front of you. But before we get stuck into things, don't forget to like, share and subscribe and hit the notification bell to let you know when I upload new content. Now, let's get started. So now let's start at the beginning of Defector with the verse. Now usually what I do for each song is to pick one tone for each section. So like the verse will have a particular sound, the chorus will have a particular sound, and so on. But with Defector it's slightly different. Just to add a little bit more variety to it, I kind of split my sounds between verse 1 and the rest of the verses. So with verse 1, I'm only using my overdrive distortion. Now this covers both channels, so effectively it's sort of mono. I'm not trying any trickery, I'm not doing the kind of the whammy technique, I'm just using the overdrive distortion straight down the middle. For now at least, maybe one day I will do the little whammy trick that I've discovered, but for the opening verse of the song. Now the settings for the pedal itself is leaning quite a lot towards the distortion side of things because of the nature of this song. You want a big, fat sound. Yes, where you might argue you want a bigma for that sound, but that sort of thing will come later on. To me and to my ear, the overdrive distortion works really well for this opening part of the song. It's got the nice amount of clarity and it's got the right amount of punch to at least get you started. It's pretty simple, it's very straightforward, and it sounds like this. Part of my decision to have it appear in both sides of the stereo field, to be left and right, so it's effectively mono, is to have this idea of a kind of solid, chunky wall of sound at the beginning. No kind of variety either sides. Straight down the middle, it's one solid sound. For the opening of the song, it works brilliantly and it sounds great to me. And then for later on, for the other verses, that's where the variety kind of comes in. But we'll get to that when we get to it. So that's the intro and verse 1 done. Now let's look at the first chorus. So moving on to what I'm calling the first chorus of Defector. Now it's quite interesting to call it that because it's quite ambiguous, and also it's quite interesting to note, to draw any sort of attention to this part of the song, because there is, on the record at least, no guitar going on. It's just a guitar break, there's vocals, bass and drums, there's nothing going on. Which leaves it as a bit of a blank canvas, and in my cover I just hold a kind of a D power chord and then occasionally play something else around it, a little improvisation. Which is sort of where I lean towards this side of thing, and to help articulate those sounds, I want a way less intense kind of distortion sound. So I switch over to my blues driver, and to help create a bit more of an ambience to it, I throw in some delay tapped into the tempo of the song, which is 76 BPM. And that's effectively it. Again, the same with the intro sound, there is no craziness either side. It's straight down the middle, the same sound. So there's no interesting kind of variations with the kind of settings and so on. So again, at the moment, it's still quite audibly and kind of mechanically quite simplistic. The riff is very straightforward to play, and the first chorus, if you will, is non-existent, and it's a blank canvas for you to play around with. So the chorus, for the first one at least, is pretty simple. So let's move on to the next verse. So now we're finally into something that sounds a little bit more interesting with verse 2. So distortion wise, I'm using both my prime distortion and my overdrive distortion. Obviously both are in one either side of the stereo field. And to add a little bit more complexity to it, I'm using my detune trick, partly because these two pedals on their own have a phasing issue where they start to cancel each other out. So using the whammy trick helps kind of knock some of that phase into sort of the right direction. I then might start to use some kind of phase cancelling plugins on Logic separately, but the whammy trick here at least helps to kind of sort out some of those phasing issues. I'm still sort of like playing around with it and experimenting with it, but that's the broad idea of what's going on. Now, because we're starting to use two different pedals on either side of the stereo field, it is getting a bit more interesting. We've got the bright clarity from the prime distortion really cutting through, and a bit more of the chunkier sound. Not very chunky, but a bit more of the weightier side from the overdrive distortion. And together, these two sounds sound really good. And they sound like this. On a minor note, I might decide to change some of the settings for these pedals, rolling up or down the distortion on the prime distortion, for example, or maybe indeed changing some of the distortion or overdrive balance on the overdrive distortion. It's all about fine-tuning and finding a sound that I personally like. But the idea for the sound that I'm after for this is what I've just shown you. It's really simple, and to have two solid distortion sounds with their own sorts of characteristics in there goes a long way to help give you a wide stereo field. In terms of the sounds that you'd want to go for if you don't have a stereo rig, either of these pedals is really good. They both have their advantages and disadvantages, which the other kind of helps to kind of make up for. So I would argue that both are good. If it was down to me to just have one for this part, for verse 2, I'd go with the prime distortion for the main sound. Conversely, in the first verse, I would use the overdrive distortion, partly to see that kind of change or the evolution of that sound as the song goes on. And that is effectively it. From verse 2 onwards, for every time that riff appears, I would use this sound, and that's what I do use for this sound in my recent cover for it. Now for the second chorus of Defector. Now this part appears, for me at least, in two sections. First part is with the whammy on, turned all the way up, behind, and you're scratching the strings behind the nut, and ever so slightly just easing off on the whammy to kind of pull down some of that tension, and then you move over to the second part, which is just some light crunch and some palm muting, and that's effectively it. It's very simple and it's very straightforward. A key part of it is the use of delay, especially for the first part, with the whammy section. The longer delay time which you'd get from this is going to help you kind of create more of a nice ambient feel, and that solid delay time would stand in good stead for the second half of this chorus and the solo later on, but let's not get into that just now. Obviously, listening to the original version of the track to hear how slowly that comes down will stand you in good stead. I would strongly recommend any of you playing that to follow that slow kind of lumbering kind of pace with it to fit in with the overall feel of the song. So in terms of the pedal setup for this, I'm just using my whammy, blues, crunch pedal, and some delay. All of it straight down the middle into a kind of a mono sound. It doesn't want to be anything too out there, it's just supporting the rhythm, which is why I've not decided to have two distortion sounds either side. Straight down the middle will work just fine. And with all that in mind, it'll sound like this. Now moving on to the solo for Defector. Now this is where I would argue is the most exciting and kind of sonically interesting part of the whole song. In terms of the setup for this, it's guitar, whammy, then the signal splits off into one side, which is the big muff, and then that goes into my interface. And then the second half is from the whammy into my overdrive distortion and into my delay pedal. What I'm also able to do is to use my volume pedal as my expression pedal for the whammy, so I don't actually have to use the treadle on the whammy itself. Now it's a bit of a minor thing to kind of use it for because the treadle's right there as well as my volume pedal, but I feel that the volume pedal is a little bit more sturdy and I can get a little bit more of a nice feel for it, a bit more control with that than the actual treadle of the whammy itself. The treadle on the whammy is great, but I just prefer the actual larger platform to get my foot on from the Boss pedal itself, and the fact that it's a little bit more easier to kind of reach as it's a bit more to the side rather than in front of me where I could slip or hit another pedal that I don't want to. It just makes things a lot easier to do. With all of these combined, the solo sounds huge. We've got that solid, nice, beefy, great mid-tones from the big muff itself, and then the kind of crispness and the kind of a more punchier distortion from the overdrive distortion itself, and the delay just helps to add even more ambience to itself. And this sound I use for both of the solos and the outro. They cover everything that I need them to. I don't really think I need to or want to play around with the ordering of effects between each solo. In terms of a broad approach for a mono pedal board, I would say that the overdrive distortion pedal is the ideal pedal to go for the distortion for the solo, just because it has a broader reach of sounds. So after talking about it, let's just hear what the solo sounds like. And there we have it. With the solos done, we've covered every individual part of Defector, so let's now debrief in the outro. So there we go, that's Defector done from start to finish. As you might have been able to tell on a basic level, the song sonically is quite simple and basic to kind of get your head around, which is why I incorporated some of the stereo elements to make it a little bit more interesting and to have more of a narrative journey, which is part of the reason why I had one sound for the first verse and then a different one for the second verse onwards. It might not be so accurate as for what's going on in the recorded version, but for me and what's going on thematically with the song, and to keep it interesting, it does work quite well. It could be easily argued that this is more of a sound like me than sound like Defector specifically, but the things that I've shown you and the things that I've gone through work really well to kind of get a good sound that lends itself really well to Defector. On a more broader note, the tricks that I've shown you work really quite well for a good number of Muse songs, but I'm sure we can get to those in the future. So as always, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you could, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, and also put in some ideas about songs that you'd like me to cover in a future Soundlike video. I've been Harry, and thanks for watching.